All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. This session is When Crimes Converge at the Intersection of Human Trafficking and Intimate Partner Violence. This is being presented by retired Chief Dave Ryan and Courtney Albert. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to them.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, 2 rules. You can't fall asleep because you ate a big lunch. It's good to be here. Thank you to DCGS for the invitation. My name is Dave Ryan. Retired after 40 years in law enforcement. The last 23 years as Chief of Police of a small town in northern Westchester County. But I actually didn't retire from law enforcement. I just transitioned from Chief of Police to the Director of the Westchester County Domestic Violence High Risk Team and the Director of the Westchester County Human Trafficking Task Force. So now I have twice as much on my plate and just don't have to deal with barking dogs. And I'm joined today by my very long-time training partner, Courtney Albert from Give Way to Freedom. For those that work in advocacy here, she's one of the best in the business. I teach this all over the country. You need to understand, you need to know Courtney if you're going to do any type of human trafficking work. She is a resource in New York State, unlike most others.
Hi everyone, I'm Courtney Albert. Thank you for that, Dave. I'm a clinical mental health counselor in private practice in New York State, and I also have my Foundation for Human Trafficking Survivors. I'm a trauma therapist, so I specialize in treating people who are victims of any type of interpersonal violence. So that includes domestic violence, that includes human trafficking, sexual assault, adult survivors of child abuse. And one of the things we'll be talking about today is how, in many cases, and for many of my clients, these crimes overlap. And today we're focusing predominantly on the overlap between intimate partner violence and human trafficking. So my background, I've worked overseas with human trafficking and torture survivors, and I've worked here in the US with domestic survivors. So all of my work, all of my trainings are informed by my clients. Working with them, their experiences with law enforcement, having to testify, even trying to heal right in the therapy sessions. So I'm taking all of that information, and that's what's going in here today.
Thanks, Courtney. Okay, a couple of things. Just a quick feel for the audience. How many law enforcement? In any, whether it's prosecutors, law enforcement, probation, parole, advocacy, civil legal, courts, others. What are the others? Oh, terrific. Very important. Very important. Okay. A couple of things about today. With me, it's old habits die hard. I've been teaching, for those that have been around a real long time, I was trained by Colleen McGrath from OPDB when she was executive director back in the mid-1980s. So if you remember her, you've been around as long as me. Anybody remember Colleen? No. I've been doing this too long, I guess. I use the term he a lot when referring to abusers and she when referring to victims. Part of it's old habits die hard, but the reality is we know anybody can be a victim. And please understand that I certainly don't mean to disrespect anybody. The other thing is we're going to show a few videos and play an audio. They are very emotional. They are raw. We stop after showing one of them to give you a half-hour break. We've had people walk out of the room crying. It is not our intention to be traumatic, but you need to understand trauma to understand this work. And so when you see the video, we're going to give you that half-hour break to just gather your thoughts. And we want you to come back and talk to us about it. Not about the trauma, but about what you saw, what you heard, how the interviews went. Has anybody here ever watched a complete body cam video of the Gap Cheeto Brian Laundrie traffic stop on the internet? Anybody ever here watch it from start to finish? Pretty gut-wrenching, right? It is, especially if we have the misfortune of knowing the outcome and what could very well have been prevented. So please understand that. If you are traumatized because we don't know what you've experienced in your career, in your life, and you have to get up and walk out of the room, that's okay. That's okay. Wellness is important. Okay? So these are kind of our objectives today. Building an understanding of trafficking and the intersectionality with intimate partner violence and other IPV, GBV related crimes. Why? because law enforcement isn't getting called to these. We're discovering them, and you only discover them if you know what to look for. One of the victims you're going to hear, one of the survivors you're going to hear from, was married to her abuser. You go to a DV call, if you don't dig deeper, you're allowing, you may be helping the domestic violence, but you also may be perpetuating the trafficking. So we're going to teach you and talk a lot of it today about how to do that, how to dig deeper, what to look for. And when you find it, what next? And then the importance of a trauma-informed multidisciplinary approach. I know both OPDV and DCGS are kind of on the crossroads of really creating these coordinated community responses. So in Westchester County, I told you the 2 teams that I run, we have 35 partner agencies on the high-risk team with 45 police departments that participate. And on the the human trafficking task force, we have almost 70 partners. When you calculate in, we have the U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Labor, everybody that's a partner. That's a true multidisciplinary team. You shouldn't be doing any of this work, DV or human trafficking, in your silo anymore. If you do, you're failing yourself, you're failing the victims, and you're probably not succeeding at the level that you could. So why is the intersection important? First of all, they're both human rights violations. That's the way I look at it. You have the right to be free from abuse in your home. When we look at the intersection of both domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and trafficking, we're looking at patterns of behavior, and we're using language that law enforcement might not be so familiar with. We're just, we started, 5, 8, 9 years ago hearing the terms trauma-informed. How long have you been hearing the term coercive control? Law enforcement, not too long. It doesn't exist in a lot of the manuals. But we're trying to get the thinking away from that violence model, right, that incident in the moment, to the bigger picture, the pattern of behavior over time that somebody can be controlled at that level based on force, fraud, and coercion.
So how many of you have already had a previous training in human trafficking? Okay, so a decent amount, at least half. So this isn't a 101. We're going to be flying through some basic concepts just to make sure we're all on the same page. And I hope we touch on enough of them for those of you who've never had a training. At least you'll have some understanding as we move through the presentation. So this is a really distilled down definition of what human trafficking is, because it's really about exploitation. It's about a person or a group of people who are exploiting another person for their personal gain. And they're doing it in different industries, right? The purpose of it is either in a compelled labor situation, so it could be manufacturing, agriculture, a fishery, hair and nail salons, or a commercial sex act, so in the commercial sex industry. So they're exploiting someone in one of those industries through either force, fraud, or coercion, or a mixture, and in many instances, it's a mixture of those concepts, these issues. So, to understand human trafficking, we also have to understand that there's a lot of myths out there. And I like this slide because if you only think about the movie Taken, or even the movie Sound of Freedom, I do appreciate that those movies draw attention to the issue. However, they don't give an accurate picture of what human trafficking looks like. For example, most people just assume it's all women and girls who are victims, and that is just not true. When you look across all of the cases globally and even in our country, when you factor in labor trafficking and sex trafficking, the split is actually more like 60-40. Okay? So there's a lot more men and boys who are also being trafficked. The key to being trafficked is having a vulnerability. If that trafficker identifies a vulnerability and monopolizes on it, then that person can end up in a trafficking situation. So men, women, and children can be victims of trafficking. Now, the International Labor Organization a few years ago added forced marriage into the numbers. And with that, the split became bigger. So now it's about 70% women, 30% men in these cases, because forced marriage was brought in there. Also in the image, you see kind of like this guy, looks like a man, over Taylor Swift here. A lot of times people assume traffickers are all men. That is also not true. There are many traffickers who are women, couples, gangs, full-fledged organized crime. foreign nationals, U.S. citizens, all different races and genders. So it's important to understand that traffickers are not just men. And they're usually not strangers to the victim. In the majority of trafficking cases, the trafficker is someone the victim knows. They're a friend, they're a family member, they are a spouse, they are an intimate partner. And we see Taylor Swift here tied up. It's really easy for us to understand the concept of force. We understand someone can't get away if they're tied up. We understand they can't get away if the door's locked. We have a harder time understanding why it is someone doesn't leave if that's not the case. And I hope by the end of today, you will have a very good understanding as to why. Coercive control, the power and control dynamics, psychological coercion, fraud are extremely powerful. I'm going to jump here for a moment. These are the key elements: force, fraud, and coercion. Force, again, those are things we might be more able to see. But things like fraud, false promises, fraudulent employment contracts, you think you're coming to this country for one job, but then you're forced into something else. Coercion, all different types of coercion that we'll be getting into later on. But for example, threats to self, threats to loved ones, threats to pets. These are very real for the people in those situations. If someone's children is being threatened, or their child is being threatened, someone is likely to then comply if they believe their child is in danger. So keeping in mind that for different people, different things matter to them. And the trafficker understanding that and monopolizing on that is extremely powerful. I'm going to jump back for a minute. There are 3 different populations of trafficking victims in the United States. We have minors involved in commercial sex. We also have anyone over the age of 18 involved in commercial sex via force, fraud, or coercion. So basically what that means is if a child, anyone under 18, is found in commercial sex, they're to be viewed as a victim. That means you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. It doesn't mean that there isn't force, fraud, or coercion. That's certainly there. You just don't have to prove it to prove trafficking. If you have an adult in the situation, then you have to prove there's elements of force, fraud, or coercion. And then this last bullet is about labor trafficking. So children and adults forced into a wide variety of different industries via force, fraud, or coercion.
So, show of hands, who's seen the ant model? You're all shy? No, honestly, nobody's seen the ant model. Wow. Okay, so in this great city of Albany where our legislative bodies sit, they come up with some good and some not so good laws, but they put together a lot of language in those laws, right? So if you're in law enforcement, a person is guilty of X when a lot of other stuff. This slide here breaks down the elements of trafficking and other things very simply into what I call buzzwords. Why do I call them buzzwords? Every single time I interview a victim of potential trafficking, I carry this slide with me on a piece of paper, and I just conduct a conversation. It's not an interrogation. I'm looking to get history. I'm looking to get information. And I listen for these buzzwords. I listen for the recruiting, that they were solicited on the internet, that they were transported, or their travel arrangements were made, that their passport was taken. All of those kind of actions on the left that are part of the elements of the crime of trafficking, both on the federal level and on the state level in the state of New York. And then, of course, Courtney just talked about means, right? Force, fraud, or coercion. Right? That can look like a lot of things. That other slide, I had that with me too, because I listened to the threats to family, threats of deportation. One of the most recent cases I had, one of the traffickers was a retired police officer, actually retired police sergeant. There's another case that I wasn't involved in at the end, but at the beginning it was a police officer, a working police officer. That was one of the traffickers. And then purpose, the involuntary servitude, the debt bondage, the peanuts, and the sex trade, right? So when you combine the 3 of them and listen in your interview for those buzzwords, that's when the clock has to start ticking to thinking of there's just a little bit more to this than guarantee this person is here to complain because they weren't paid the right amount of money, or somebody didn't comply with a contract, or something else. We gotta dig deeper. We talked about that a lot this morning in another training. The goal in trafficking cases is to dig deeper because victims do not call 911. Domestic violence victims do, not all of them, but some of them. Trafficking victims, we have to find them. And the only way we're going to find them is ask the right questions when we have the opportunity. That opportunity may only come once. So this, for the law enforcement in the room, this is where you need to dig deeper. The child abuse claim, the immigration call, the substance abuse call, whatever it may be, is not always just that, right? You think of where trafficking has occurred just in Westchester County, right? I can speak a lot about Westchester County because that's where I work. A lot of immigration issues, a lot of labor trafficking. We actually have more labor trafficking in our adult population than we have sex trafficking, which is more predominant in our youth population. So when the individual walks into the police station and says, I'm here because I was promised, $300 a day for the last year and have received nothing, it's not a civil matter. It's not, yeah, you can go to court next door and file a small claim and see if you can get your money. No, sit down, let's talk. Let's see what that looks like. Same with sexual assault, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, obviously. And ironically, the first human trafficking case I ever participated in was the first one in Westchester. It was actually our department, and a victim actually fled their home at 11 o'clock at night. Anybody here from Westchester? This is really disappointing. So if you know the town where I was police chief, there are no street lights. There are no traffic lights. Our business district is about half the size of this room. It is a very quiet, remote town in the northeast corner of Westchester. And that victim fled down a road for 2.5 miles, not speaking English, with the clothes on her back, not knowing what to expect. By the grace of God, somebody drove by, and nobody drives on the roads of Pound Ridge after 10 o'clock at night, who spoke her language. The grace of God. Brought her to the police station. And we found out what trafficking was, and I knew nothing about it. But this is where we have to look. This is where you're going to see it. And this is where you have to dig deeper.
And of all of these things, today we're obviously digging deeper into the overlap between human trafficking and intimate partner violence. So again, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page around concepts and definitions, just highlighting again what intimate partner violence is, right? It's any behavior in a relationship that's causing physical, psychological, or sexual harm to someone in that relationship. And it's important to understand that that can happen not just between married couples, but between couples who are just dating, couples that aren't even living together. It can happen in gay and or straight relationships. It can happen, again, in any kind of race, identity type relationship. And just like as we talk about with human trafficking, right? Force, fraud, coercion being those big elements. Intimate partner violence, it's important to understand that there's also different elements there. There's the physical violence, which again, yes, we understand that more. The hitting, the kicking, the slapping. There's also a lot of sexual violence. And it's important for all of us to understand that even if it's a married couple, rape exists. There is such thing as marital rape, keeping that in mind. And then looking at, just as with coercion, being harder to understand, easier to conceal, emotional abuse and controlling behaviors. Look at how many are listed. Look at the wide variety of things. Humiliation, insults, destruction of property, threats of harm, threats to take children away, controlling behaviors, isolating, monitoring, very similar to the coercion that you see in human trafficking cases, same types of emotional abuse and controlling behaviors. The power and control dynamics between intimate partner violence and human trafficking are extremely similar. So much so that if any of you are familiar with the power and control wheel for domestic violence, they have made one for trafficking, and they practically mirror one another. So it's very important to understand that we're seeing a lot of overlap in the types of tactics that are being used. And why is that? because it's extremely powerful. These tactics work. So as Dave was saying, cases that may appear as domestic violence initially, if you look under the surface, there can be trafficking happening underneath. In a lot of the cases that I've worked with, the victims were actually trafficked by an intimate partner, whether that was their husband, whether it was a boyfriend, and sometimes they were one of a group of women that were being trafficked, and other times they were the only person being trafficked by their husband or partner. It's not uncommon for there to be a wide variety of trafficking as well. So for example, I had a client whose husband trafficked her for commercial sex, but also would make her arrange dates and have sex with people not for money. So that's actually forced non-commercial sex, which can be classified as involuntary servitude. So both were being used. There are also cases where it's labor trafficking that's taking place. So there's intimate partner violence within the home, and then the trafficking is actually for the labor industry, whether that person is forced as a domestic servitude into someone's house, or they're working in some other type of manufacturing plant or agriculture, but it's actually labor trafficking taking place at the hands of either their intimate partner or a family member. And sometimes cases where it starts out as a marriage and there's intimate partner violence, it progresses into trafficking. I had one client who had divorced her husband when he was in jail on another offense. Once he had gotten out, he actually was involved in her kidnapping and subsequent trafficking. So again, it may not always start out that way, but these relationships are complex. Really important study, and I don't think we talk enough about offenders. If we have all this overlap with the victims and the power and control dynamics and all of that, it makes a lot of sense that the offenders are the same. In this particular study, they looked at offenders, so these are people who trafficked for domestic trafficking, so let me clarify that for a moment. The United States is a transit country, a destination country for human trafficking, right? So we have our own US victims, we have victims that come in from other countries. In this particular case, these were traffickers who trafficked US citizens, right? So we have international trafficking, we have domestic trafficking. These were US citizens being trafficked, and those traffickers had histories of intimate partner violence, general violence in the community, and additional sexual violence. Look at the high numbers. They were arrested on domestic trafficking, 71% had a documented history of intimate partner violence. And I'm sure many of you saw the news, Sean Diddy Combs, classic, right? Right now, last night, I'm like, oh, this is perfect timing. So he, of course, history of intimate partner violence, and as well as trafficking. So these offenders are often offenders of different types of violence in our community, and paying attention to that is really important.
Again, just for the law enforcement in the room, which is the bulk of the room, just do the math here. They presented themselves to law enforcement in some other domain, right? So this kind of speaks really to what today's all about. These may have been opportunities where trafficking was discovered, but we know that they were not. But look at the history of violence underneath those, and think about how many of them engaged with law enforcement or advocacy or whomever, family court, where it was an opportunity missed to uncover that trafficking. Okay, so tough words to hear if you work with law enforcement, right? But that's the voice of a survivor, and that's who we should be listening to, right? So let's talk about this for a second. And this is where we want feedback from you. This is not Courtney and I standing up here. We're not moving on until we get that feedback. So I'm going to kind of go right to the third portion. What do you think Lisa's message was to us in this room here today? Anyway, go ahead.
Do your job, all day.
Thank you. Do your job. Anybody else? Come on.
Don't be complacent.
Don't be complacent. Some more.
Busted stereotypes.
Stereotype?
Yeah,
Yep.
busted stereotypes.
Absolutely. What else? Don't assume. What else? Look beyond the surface. I love this guy. She used another word that law enforcement is not always so good about demonstrating. And what is that? You're damn right. Now, listen, this is not to offend law enforcement. We are not trained and have I was doing it 40 years. I was never trained to be empathetic. I was trained, go to this call, fill out this form. If there's a mandatory arrest, that's different now. We know better now. We need to be empathetic. We need to be in the moment when we need to be. That Norman Rockwell paint, so that we can engage that survivor over time, because it's not going to happen in the moment, so they begin to trust us, so that we don't appear judgmental, that we should never start a question with, why did you X, Y, Z? Right? We know that now, right? What else? What else did you hear her say? What words did you hear her use that say we need to do better? Anybody? You know, we ask victims that are traumatized to give us information that something very traumatic happened 10 minutes ago, and you just listened to a 7-minute video. Give me something. What's that? Right. Right. The bottom line is, I'm going to go back to the gentleman in the room, in the back of the room. When you go to these calls, do your job. And your job is more than filling out a piece of paper or stated to report. It is to dig deeper.
And here's some helpful tips. We do have this PDF available, so just so you know, it is available for all of you. I don't know if it's coming through DCJS or you can email us. We have our cards and we can certainly make sure that you get a copy. Really important to understand not just the red flags and indicators, though they're important. We want to know what those are, we want to keep them in mind, but we also want to understand the context. So pattern recognition, what are the red flags for domestic violence? Are the red flags for human trafficking? And then what is the context? Does the story match the scene? If there are injuries, do the injuries really line up with the story that's being told? Does it look like someone's being coached or is fearful? So keeping aware of all of these things. And again, it's not a 101 on human trafficking, so I'm not delving into the indicators. If you haven't had a 101 training, please go and get one, because it is really informative and it will delve much more into all of these things. But just some ones to highlight. When someone is fearful and mistrusting, there's going to be gaps in stories. So if the story isn't lining up, then it's not that they're most likely lying to you, it's that they're afraid to tell you something. So just keeping that in mind, gaps in stories is a huge one. So we're going to talk now about the totality of the victim experience, because in order to uncover these cases, in order to get to know victims and to end up working with them and actually moving all the way through to having a successful prosecution, it's important to understand their entire experience. It is not just the middle box. It's not just, okay, what happened to them while they were being trafficked. It's important to understand, how did they get into the situation to begin with? What is the backstory? What were their vulnerability factors or risk factors? Were they the victim of other crimes? I don't know if any of you are familiar with the term polyvictimization. It was developed by a researcher named David Ficklemore, and he talked about in studies, the victim of one crime is often the victim of multiple crimes. So in many cases, you have someone who's already been the victim of a crime. And so that might make them more vulnerable to additional crimes. So understanding vulnerabilities. Why is this important? Does anyone have any idea why this might be important? Traffickers are very good at seeing vulnerabilities and then targeting them. If you have a youth who's run away and needs shelter and is looking for companionship, then that's exactly what the trafficker is going to offer. Can you give me a place to stay? Oh, I'll give you a place to stay. They start by giving something that the person needs. They recruit them this way. So we need to understand What was it that that person needed that the trafficker then monopolized on? This impacts a victim, because in most cases, victims are not kidnapped. It can happen. It does happen. In my history of working with clients, I had one client that was actually kidnapped. The rest were all tricked, manipulated into the situation. They were offered things. They believed that person. And then there was the flip of the switch. So understanding the backstory being incredibly important. Then, of course, we want to understand what happened to them during the trafficking, what elements of force, fraud, or coercion were being used. And then we want to understand then, given the backstory and given what happened to them during the trafficking, what does that mean for the outcomes? Once they're out, once we're working with them, it's important to understand the level of trauma they've experienced, because that impacts their behaviors. Someone who is traumatized may be behaving in ways that make it difficult to interact with them, make it difficult to get the actual full story initially. There are different coping mechanisms, stigma, their difficulty disclosing. We're going to talk about a variety of these things throughout these 2 sessions today. I'm not going to delve much into this, but I just want to mirror it. That was the first one was human trafficking. Think about intimate partner violence in the exact same way. There's a backstory there. What happens in the relationship? What kind of violence? And then what does that mean for the victim? Level of trauma, how they're coping, their ability to disclose, stigma around intimate partner violence. Why didn't you just leave, right? So again, just touching on the backstory for a moment, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the socio-ecological model, but basically it talks about the fact that there are vulnerability factors at all different levels. We're not, again, delving into it today, but just to highlight, at the individual level, interpersonal level, community level, and societal level, there are vulnerability factors. And the more vulnerabilities someone has, the more likely they are to be targeted by a trafficker. And really hard to know right off the bat that someone's a trafficker, isn't it? They don't look like monsters. These are all traffickers. Men, women, all different races, couples, teenagers, well, yes, they do, yes, they do. And then well-respected members in a community. In one case, it was a rabbi within the community. So sometimes it's the very people, Dave talked about a law enforcement officer, that someone might actually turn to is the trafficker. So it's really hard, right? Someone's offering something that you really want, they don't look like a monster. So it's really important to understand that most of the time, people are not, the force is not the first element that's presented to someone. Usually they're offered something that they want or need. And then it's over time that violence starts to get introduced. Most people don't lead with the violence because a lot of people might walk away right away. But if it becomes this slippery slope, things start happening. So we're going to start talking about this. You're in this situation now. What's going on? It's important to understand when you're working with a victim, how long have they been in it? How long have they been in it? Is it 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years? Because the amount of time someone's in it will impact them and their mental health and their physical health. What is the relationship they have to the perpetrator? Today we're focusing a lot on intimate partner violence. So these are cases where the perpetrator is someone that is supposed to love them, that they have an intimate relationship with. I mean, think about it. If you're betrayed by a stranger, it really doesn't matter that much, right? But if you're betrayed by a family member, that's different, isn't it? That hurts a lot more, it's confusing. So really important to understand that when the relationship is an intimate partner relationship, it is a really complex situation. And then understanding what are the different types of physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence that are going on within these relationships. So one way to look at it is by understanding psychological coercion. This study was done several years ago, and it looked at a framework that was created way back in 1957 by a researcher named Bitterman. And he looked at why was it that American soldiers gave false confessions during the Korean War. These are people who were trained not to give false confessions and to endure stress, and they still broke and gave false confessions. What was so powerful? He identified these 8 very powerful psychological coercive tactics that were then applied to trafficking. So we're going to share them with you. Isolation. Why is isolation important? What does that do? Anyone? Yeah, it makes you feel hopeless. Yeah, you don't have as many resources. It increases a power differential. It increases the power the perpetrator holds. Monopolizing perception. They want their victim to see the world how they see it. They want to monopolize the information that that person is getting and how they view themselves in the world. They induce exhaustion. So in many cases, they're not getting enough food, enough water, enough sleep. I remember Dave, in one of his cases, talked a lot about how the women were never allowed to sleep. A bell would ring, constantly throughout the night, keeping them awake. You're keeping someone off balance. Think about what happens if you don't sleep for 2-3 nights in a row. How does the sleep deprivation impact your ability to function? They don't want their victims to be feeling really great because they're easier to control, right? If you are under a lot of duress, if you're not getting your basic needs met, you're more likely to comply. Then you have threats. And remember, the threats, different things matter to different people. So a threat to a pet, if you don't have a pet and you don't care about dogs or cats, whatever, then that might not seem like a big deal to you. But for someone who actually really loves their dog, if that dog is threatened, and in Lisa's case, who you heard from earlier, her husband killed their dog. She loved that dog, his name was Mucho. And that dog tried to protect her. I could actually get emotional. Sorry, she's my dog. This dog was a big mastiff, and he tried to protect her, and he killed her. So those things are very real things. And those threats, and he threatened the dog a lot, and he carried it out in that instance. So you have all these horrible things going on, and then you get occasional indulgences. This one's extremely important when you think about Stockholm Syndrome, what it used to be called, trauma bond. Why is it that people begin to like and appreciate their perpetrator? Because sprinkled in with all the violence and all the threats are occasional indulgences. They get to go out one night, they get a gift. The perpetrator's nice to them for a few days. Why do you think the occasional indulgence is so powerful? Yes, it's like dangling like a carrot. Yeah, it gives them something to look forward to. They want it again. Creates greater dependence. They want that nicety again. They're so desperate for it, and then they come to appreciate it. So this piece is extremely important. You counter the abusive behavior with occasional kindness or gifts. Then some other things demonstrating omnipotence. They claim powerful connections to law enforcement. Oh, you can go try to report, but I'm good friends with Chief Ryan. So you can go ahead, but they're not going to listen to you. Degradation, insults, humiliation, denial of privacy. In one case in Boston, I trained with one of the doctors up there, a lot of medical providers. There's a case up there where there were a bunch of women that they'd starved repeatedly, and then they'd take a couple Happy Meals from McDonald's and toss them on the floor and watch the women fight for the food. So just think about how degrading that is, how humiliating it is. And then enforcing trivial demands. And this is something where, I don't know if any of you saw the movie Sleeping with the Enemy, Julia Roberts. Don't know if I'm dating myself. In that movie, she had to line all the cans up in the cupboard exactly the same way. Towels had to be lined up. When someone is spending so much time having to do these trivial demands, and if they don't do it, there's a consequence. Think about that. If your whole day is having to do these little things, or you're going to have a consequence, you can't think about the bigger picture all the time. You're too afraid in the moment to get everything right.
So just add a couple of things before we move on to the next slide. For the law enforcement in the room, and an honest show of hands, how many times have you walked out of a DV case, intimate partner or otherwise, and said, it's a he said, she said, I can't figure it out. There's no physical evidence. Put your hand up, come on. It happens. If you don't put your hand up, I know you're lying to me. It happens all the time. I hear it. I see it on DIRs. I get every DIR on lap screen in Westchester County. This is very difficult to prove. It just doesn't pop out at you. So what I would say to you is, again, this is one of those slides for domestic violence victims and for human trafficking victims that is a valuable tool for your interview and for a prosecutor. Because it's easy to prove the kind of the physical assault, right? The stuff that you have, that physical evidence that you can see. But how do you prove psychological coercion? Take these two slides, circle the buzzwords. This is what I heard. Isolation. Is it powerful? We just came out of a pandemic. Mental health calls went up 600% in this country. It affected us. Imagine how it affected that victim who deals with it every single day, along with all the other stuff. Right? The same thing. All of these 8. I promise you, if you get these into your head when interviewing, you'll do a much better job of interviewing. And those he said, she says will become, holy cow, this is psychological coercion. So again, I don't want to take a deep dive into it. We can teach this for the whole day. But this is hard to uncover. But now you have some tools to say, hey, I hear those buzzwords. I need to dig deeper.
And it's really important to start moving away from the violence model, really only looking at intimate partner violence in this way. Because if you only look at it as those moments where there's discrete moments of violence, you are missing the much bigger picture. It doesn't occur only at times of those moments of physical violence. There is always what's called this kind of coercive framework. There's always this undercurrent of fear and intimidation. So coercive control is patterned oppressive behavior using fear, intimidation, and threat and repercussion to instill compliance. And that is ever present. Even if a physical assault is over, that does not mean that everything is great. There's always this undercurrent, there's fear, there's intimidation, there are other things going on. And this model, just jump back a little, it inaccurately assumes that there's time between these different assaults where someone can really assess their relationship and make this decision to leave. The coercive control framework takes all of these other things into account and allows the abuse to be reframed so that you understand that the goal of coercive control is really about total domination. It's a condition of entrapment that can be hostage-like. So that's why, if a door is wide open, someone is not leaving. They do not feel that they can. Here's an important statistic. Victims fear staying, but feel unable to leave. Between 60 to 80% of victims seeking assistance, outside assistance, are experiencing multiple tactics to frighten, isolate, degrade, and subjugate them, as well as assaults and threats. This is why people do not leave, even if they are not bound like Taylor Swift at the beginning. The aim is total domination. I've actually had clients say that. It wasn't enough for him to control one aspect of my life. He had to control everything. Primary outcome is a condition of entrapment that is hostage-like in nature. It inflicts harm on the dignity and ability of that person to have autonomy. So just to highlight some power and control dynamics that we see in trafficking and intimate partner violence, again, keeping this, if you get our slide deck, these are things to think about. Circle them, right? Is there destruction of property, brandishing of weapons, threats, monitoring their phones, things like that. And then with trafficking, you have this added element of this possible legal ramifications. You're the one who's going to get arrested for prostitution, right? All the marketing for Lisa was on her phone, not his phone. Traffickers aren't stupid. They're not going to do it on their own phone, right? They're going to put it on the victim's phone so that so it looks like they're doing it. Oh no, they were just prostituting themselves. So reputational harm and legal ramifications. One client actually said to me, sex trafficking is like intimate partner violence on steroids. And it really is. It's the commercialized extension via the ultimate exploitation of a woman's body, not just for property, but as an object seized upon for economic benefit. It's taking intimate partner violence to a whole new level. And for victims of these types of crimes, the goal of the trafficker, I don't know if you guys know Maslow's hierarchy of need, if you've ever seen it. They destabilize all of these lower level rungs so that someone doesn't have these needs met. And it's designed to break them down so that they're not thinking about how to leave.
I will tell you this, I never even heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs until 2009 when I met Courtney. I did not go to school for psychology or sociology. I went to school for criminal justice and law enforcement. This, if you understand it, and I will tell this to law enforcement in the room, it's a 35-minute watch on YouTube, will completely change the way you interview. Just read up about it. Read up about how, whether it's trafficking, read up about how abusers break down, right? Break down the foundation of who we are. Conversely, and we'll see this in a little bit, it's how we rebuild. It's how we begin the process of healing, right? We start at the bottom. But if you understand this, it just impacts you more when you hear about it. Yeah, I haven't had a good solid meal in 3 weeks. And no, I haven't had a solid night's sleep for 2 years. It starts teaching you to think a little bit outside the box that really could have an impact on you over time. So again, something I would recommend to everybody. Okay, before we start, did you decide? Before we decided, okay, this could be a little rough if you haven't seen this video clip. It's readily available on the internet, actually the whole hour and 56 minutes of it. It's raw, and it's very telling. And I will tell you this, I've spoken to some of the people in Utah about this, where this occurred. I do not fault the officers for the outcome of this. They did what they were trained to do. This is where we need to change our training. The entire state of Utah now uses a danger assessment. These officers did not because they were not trained in it. But I want you, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take what Courtney and I have said so far, listen to this. At the end of this, we're going to stop. You get your half-hour break, digest it, kind of bring yourself back together. If this doesn't hit home, then you are not empathetic and compassionate.
And just to highlight this, with Gabby's case, this was not a trafficking case. This is solely an intimate partner violence case. But there's so much learning through watching these videos. And remember, we're talking about psychological coercion. We're going to be talking in the second half a lot about how people behave and react after they've been traumatized and how we don't necessarily read it right. So paying attention to those kinds of things in this video is being so powerful. Do I just get this?
But, so the other thing is people often say to us when we teach that show this, no, it's hard to hear. That's intentional. Police officers out on the road, a lot going on, cars driving by, radio chirping in his ear, boyfriend yelling, dog barking, baby crying, a lot going on. So sometimes it is difficult to catch everything. So people say, can't you transcribe it? No, because those of you that are not law enforcement, you need to experience what law enforcement experiences on these scenes. So I just want you to think about all of that while you watch this video. And then Susan's done.
Yeah, I believe I do any of it. I always I didn't. I really went back home crying, and he put me in the car for it. Told me to come down. Yeah. But I perfectly calm all the time.
we do this, why don't I sit you down in the backseat of my car? You're not in any trouble, okay? So I'm not going to be putting handcuffs on you. You obviously don't have any weapons. I'm going to get you into the air conditioning, let you take a breath, relax a little bit, and then I'll come back and talk to you in a few minutes, okay? All right. Like I said, you're not in any trouble. So just go ahead and take a seat. Please smile. Yeah. Go ahead. And so if you've been drinking, we're doing this driving. Self-study can occur. While you're driving? While he's driving, you're handling. I watched one piece because I didn't know what was going there. I went pictures. I don't know my phone. I don't have a phone. So she goes off now. I'm on my own. So I was like, let's just go for walk. And she was trying to teach me so it's going. Just read back up in person. I did really good well. I didn't get over greatly because I was just trying to move her away and not get hit. And then I got really loud. And that's probably your attention. I was going, back up, get away, just give me. Okay, so I said you push her to create some distance, obviously, right? What happened after that? Look out the scratches on your arm. The phone. So you push her and she hit you? She was, I wasn't going to push her. She jumped on me. She was already, I don't know, swinging there. Multiple. Yeah, I thought that ankle was on the nails on fingers. Got scratched in there. Got behind the left side of the house. Got face here. Got forward and knee. Scratched off for 2 minutes. Do you mind lifting up your right sleeve for me? I'm curious about something. Okay, I'll sit down. I suppose fingernails, but I'm not going to play. Is it bruised or tender or anything like that? I'm fine. I look good. She doesn't have too many complaints about me. I just, I feel bad that I have to get stuff up. I was just trying to be loud. I'm just trying to make her calm down. I'm like, look, everyone watch. Stop this. Okay, yeah, believe me, if I were to say that my wife had a camera hair starts up to empty, she wasn't insane. I live in the world. I know. Her anxiety always my anxiety. And sometimes people.
That's why I'm like, I gotta walk away, I gotta breathe, I'm back as you know. But
I'm not going to try to sit here and give you like, you've been on this road almost as long as what I have. There's nothing I can tell you that's going to really make a difference, but at the end of the day, I'm sorry that all this has happened. I'm sorry that it goes to this extent. I'm sorry. Why not? Can I get my food and I go out? You can go. Oh yeah, no problem. Have a good day.
It's just because they muted their body cams when they showed this video because he was giving personal information. Note to self, if you wear body cams.
This is what I'm going to do. I've decided I am not going to say for domestic violence. Okay? It was only going to be a Class B misdemeanor. However, the domestic violence portion of it enhances it. Makes a major pain in the butt, especially in your 22, right? So I'm choosing not to say it today. So you are not going to be charged with it. Alright, but this is what I do have to do. I am separated from you tonight. Okay? I want you guys both to be tonight away from each other, relax, breathe, because there's no reason to be crying now, okay? This is, I understand that this can feel like it's a nightmare, but you're coming out as the golden flower of problem, okay? So,
So we're going to take a break, but here's what I want you to think about before we take a break. I want you to think about that interview. Think about what you heard. Think about the language that law enforcement used. Think about the things that Gabby said. Think about the things that Brian said, what you hear, what you saw, the physical gyration, all that stuff. I want you to think about that. Because it's important that when you come back and talk about it for a few minutes, because to be truly trauma-informed, you need to be able to admit our faults when we look at our own body cam video and understand that yes, it's challenging sometimes to pick aggressors and identify certain things. And this is not about trafficking, but it is because the interview is the same. That initial interview is the same. So, and how long is your break until? 2:30. 2:30. So we'll see you back here at 2:30. Sharp.
All right, everyone, welcome back for part 2, and we'll turn it over to Courtney and Chief Ryan.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Just before we get started, I want to tell you what a good day today is and how complex these cases are. And of course, my phone's going to blow up for the next 2 hours. So in 2019, we did a case in the Town Rise Police. It was trafficking, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, animal abuse, and child endangering. And the attorneys for the defense put this off, but they just went to trial this week. It was a 3-day trial, and they just found him guilty on all counts. That's a lot of good work by a lot of people, prosecutors, law enforcement, advocacy, Safe Horizons. We had probably 16 advocacy agencies involved in this. The animal abuse, the therapists for the kids. This is how that collaboration works, and it takes time. These are not like the domestic violence cases, right? You make an arrest at the scene, and it's adjudicated within a year. These are complex, but texts like that, and my phone is blowing up, which is good. Everybody's saying amen, but today's a little bit better day.
So we're going to be showing and talking about the Gabby video again in a bit. So keep your thoughts about that in mind as we move through the rest of this next hour. We're moving on to that last box. Remember, I talked about the importance of the backstory, the importance of understanding what happens when someone is in this type of situation, the types of abuse that they endure, and then this last piece. What does that mean then when we are trying to identify them, when we are trying to work with them? What is their level of trauma? What does being trauma-informed really mean? What does that mean for us? Understanding that the way someone is coping may not kind of reflect our own opinions on how a victim should be behaving. We all have our own idea about what the perfect victim would look like. Maybe Taylor Swift tied up, oh, thank you so much for saving me. That is not what a victim is going to be behaving like. I spent 1 year at the Children's Home of Poughkeepsie, working with youth survivors of trafficking. And I really learned a lot from one girl in particular. She said, you can't be on the street and be a victim. You'd be dead. You cannot behave like a victim. So keeping that in mind, when you come across victims of trafficking, of domestic violence, they are not necessarily going to be acting like you think they should be. And we're going to be getting into why. So it's important to kind of, as you are trying to interact with these victims and build cases, you have to be trauma informed. What does that mean? Having this understanding of not saying what's wrong with you, but what has happened to this person that is causing them to behave in this way. And it's important to have a multidisciplinary team approach. You have to have that kind of team in place beforehand. Know the shelters available to you. Know the advocates and who you're going to be passing the victim off to in advance. If you are prepared, then you will gain more trust with that victim. Trauma. How many of you have had a course on being trauma informed and what trauma is? Okay. So hopefully they've said something similar to what you're going to hear from me, which is a lot of times the importance is not that we think something is traumatizing. Each person's experience is their own. What might be traumatizing to one person may not be to another. So the key is understanding what that person was feeling. Trauma happens when someone's system is overwhelmed. And when we're talking about intimate partner violence and we're talking about especially human trafficking, these victims have oftentimes had multiple instances of interpersonal trauma over time. So if we think about trauma on a continuum, right? Someone could be in a car accident. They've never had trauma in their life before, but they were in a car accident as an adult, and they can have post-traumatic stress disorder from that accident. That's the far end of the spectrum. And then on this other end is a lot of times what happens with human trafficking victims and survivors, multiple instances of interpersonal trauma over time. Something is done to them by someone else, multiple times. So it's important to understand that we're talking about complex trauma and how that impacts someone. It's also important to understand that what is happening before and after the incident matters. What I mean by that, especially for all of us, is how we interact with the victim, how we treat the victim matters. Simple example. Say you have a sexual assault, and I'm going to give two scenarios. First scenario, it's the same sexual assault. First scenario, woman or man goes home, tells family, and the family is supportive, gives them medical care, gets them counseling if they need it, believes them, supports them. Second scenario, same sexual assault. They go home and tell the family they're not believed, they're told never to speak of it again, they're told that they're not going to get any care, don't ever speak of it again. Same sexual assault. Which scenario do you think which person's going to fare better? Right? It's about how we treat somebody. Human trafficking survivors have a wide variety of mental health presentations. And I have seen all of these in my practice. Post-traumatic stress disorder, every single client that I have has post-traumatic stress disorder or had it when I first started seeing them. And I would argue that it's called complex PTSD because it's even beyond just that one incident. Mood disorders, anxiety, panic attacks, major depression, dissociative disorders. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but basically dissociation is an altered state of consciousness. Very important survival type of thing that happens to us when we're being traumatized. It can help us survive an overwhelming experience. The downside to dissociation is that then when we try to report back, or when someone's questioning us, we may dissociate again because the trigger of having to talk about it again, and again, it's an altered state of consciousness. So someone may present differently than what we would expect. For example, if someone's dissociating when they're talking, they may start laughing, while they're talking about something that's serious. And I bring this one up deliberately because it can be misinterpreted. If someone's talking about something horrible that has just happened to them and they're laughing, our assumption might be, they don't think this is serious, oh my God, they're laughing. It's because they're so disconnected from the experience. It's probably more of a nervous laughter. So understanding that that kind of behavior does not mean that they find it funny or they're not taking it seriously. It's an altered state of consciousness. So being mindful that when someone is talking about traumatic events, there's a very small window of tolerance usually, where they can actually maintain full awareness and talk about it. And a lot of times they're going way into some type of hyperarousal state where they're anxious. You're going to see them shaking. You're going to see their breathing getting rapid. That's time to stop. Stop talking about it because they're not even really understanding what's going on in that moment. So being mindful of that. Substance abuse disorders, oftentimes, sometimes in trafficking cases, people are forced to take drugs. They may become addicted. In other times, after the trauma's happened, they're using alcohol or drugs to try to help them with the symptoms. So sometimes you see this comorbidity of substance-related disorders when victims have these other things going on. Here's an important study that was done, and as a clinician, I love to see studies that support what I see in reality. So this looked at children who were commercially sexually exploited and looked at their behaviors and how they differ from youth that have only been sexually assaulted. Not that either are great, but look at this is statistically significant differences in behavior. Commercially sexually exploited youth, higher avoidance and hyperarousal. Avoidance, they don't want to talk about it. Hyperarousal, what I just talked about. Heart rate, their legs are shaky, they want to bolt out of the room. Those are both key characteristics of post-traumatic stress disorder. Skipping school, inappropriate sexual behavior, alcohol, substance use, criminal activity, and running away. These are the kids that a lot of times we say are problem kids. We need to dig deeper. Why are they doing this? Why are they running away? Why are they behaving in this way?
So again, we talk a lot about digging deeper and this intersectionality. Look at the math. It's not guesswork. This is real. So in law enforcement, and it's a struggle to deal with runaways, children that are just dealing with youth in general. Because I had 2 teenage daughters and I was a police chief as a father, so that was not easy. But at the end of the day, if you look at what's up on this board and we talk about digging deeper and it's that person that's running away from that group home or whatever it is 2, 3, 4 times a week, it's not going to the group home, Jesus Christ, do your goddamn job, keep these people here, we're going to report you to the State Justice Center, or, you find the kid at the train station, drag him into the car, don't make us have to look for you again. You gotta find a way to engage these kids. Where are they going? Who's picking them up? If the child has no ungodly reason to have any possession of value and they have an iPhone 14, $600 Jordan sneakers, and they're wearing a Louis Vuitton bag, you better ask some questions because they either stole it or somebody is groomed or grooming them. You have to ask those questions. We could talk about just this for a day, how to interview these kids, how to dig deeper, what to look for. But this is a lost opportunity if you don't take it.
So remember, a lot of times the coping strategies that people are using to survive their situation can be very difficult to work with. So, especially in relation to the kids, agitation and deflection are huge. So it's hard to work with someone who's kind of yelling back at you or being rude and things like that. But understanding, again, that mindset, what's happened to this person that they're behaving this way, not taking it personally, trying to find another avenue to begin to build trust with them. Most victims do not self-identify. And a lot of the time, they often don't see themselves as victims because over time, they've normalized their abuse. So they begin, right, in order to survive a situation for a long period of time, you have to minimize how bad it is. And that's why tools like the danger assessment, and we'll talk about that later, are so important. Because when you fill out, and I did this actually with the client whose voice you heard, We sat in the office after, it was shortly after we first started working together, and I had gotten the danger assessment out. We went through it together. I don't remember exactly what her score was, but she was way off the charts on likely of being a victim of homicide. And even for her, she was surprised by the result. Because when you're in it all the time, you have to minimize how bad it is so that you can get through every day. So then to really see it back and realize how in danger they are can be very eye-opening for them. That tool can be very powerful, not only for you, but for the victims themselves. Avoidance of trauma triggers. A lot of times people don't want to talk about what's happened because their symptoms get worse. They have more nightmares. They may have flashbacks while they're trying to talk to you. So understanding that it's very difficult for survivors to talk about traumatic experiences. Kind of key things. There's a lot of shame around it. Things that they've had to endure, things that they have done that they never thought that they would do. Really difficult to talk about. Maybe they have a trauma bond to their explorer, especially if it's their partner. I had one client say to me, I know that I'm supposed to hate him, but I still love him. And I know I'm really supposed to think that he's this horrible person, but he actually gave me more than my own family ever did. So when you're talking about these cases that are complex, there's a lot of mixed emotions. There could be fear also. When you're talking to someone who's an abuser, it's extremely violent, they're afraid for their safety. They've been threatened. They're not going to open up because they know the consequence. And so, instead of the Taylor Swift tied up and, oh, thank you for helping me image, I want you to keep this image in mind. This is what trafficking survivors more likely will behave like. They're either going to be really startled, perhaps dissociated, or they may be lashing out and angry because they want to push you away and they don't want to talk about it. Disclosure is important in order to help prosecute cases, but it can be very challenging for two reasons. There can be barriers to disclosure, and that could be that the client actually, or the person can tell you what's going on, but they're not for some reason. They don't trust you. Maybe the perpetrator's still in the room. Figuring out why it is that the person isn't speaking to you, and we're going to get into that. And then sometimes there's something called genuine failure of recall that happens with traumatic memories. Traumatic memories are not encoded in the brain the same way. It doesn't mean they're not accurate, but they're encoded differently. And so they cannot give a nice, neat narrative like A, B, C, D, E, F. That is very difficult for trauma survivors to do. And we're going to show a very brief video clip that helps to give some understanding to that.
You just have to do it twice. Sure, not this one. There's the good doctor. Has anybody ever heard Rebecca Campbell speak? It's amazing. So this video, as Dr. Campbell speaks, Rebecca Campbell was an expert and a researcher from Michigan State University whose expertise is in neurobiology of trauma. And we like this video because it kind of brings it down to our level. I always used to say, you know, my IT guy would create a records management issue to a program. And so you got to dumb it down to my worst IT technology copy, because if not, it's not going to work. This is kind of what Dr. Campbell does in this video. She really brings the neurobiology of trauma language to something we can easily understand and apply, not only in our own personal lives, if somebody in our department is involved in a trauma shooting, but certainly with any victim, whether it's intimate partner violence or trafficking.
One is
Good doctors a little loud.
two basic neurobiological processes that we're looking at. One is what hormones are released and how does that affect behavior during.
Well, good doctors speaking on one and not on the other. I don't know what that is. So we're going to try and activate the good doctor up here. Is my IT guy here? No.
We'll grab them.
So let me, hang on. There's a way here. We're gonna watch this. The magic of double screens.
So during a traumatic situation, so again, for some survivors, they have adrenaline. It's what pumps your body up, pulls released in their bodies, or some have multiple hormones and chemicals released at the time of the assault. One of which are going to be the catecholamines. Catecholamines are like natural adrenaline. It's what pumps your body up in a traumatic or stressful situation that would help a survivor be able to fight back against the attacker or try to flee from the situation. Another hormone that's often released for survivors during an assault are the corticosteroids, and those work in conjunction with the catecholamines to determine how much energy is available. So again, for some survivors, they have a lot of energy available to fight back and to flee, and they stay very pumped up after the assault. But some don't. It sort of bottoms out and flattens out on them, and they might freeze during the assault, or they might be in kind of a stupor almost after the assault. Other hormones that affect the behavior at the time of the assault are opiates, which is like natural morphine. So some survivors during the assault report feeling like they're almost drugged, that they're out of it, and then when they do first responder interviews later, they have no affect. They're just describing it with no emotion, no affect. You know, like they're reading out of a TV guide. There's just nothing to them. That's the opiates. The opiates help block physical pain, which you need during a traumatic situation, but they also just keep blunting everything, okay? The other hormone that's sometimes released is oxytocin, and this is a hormone that promotes good feelings. And that may sound strange, or why would you have a hormone that's about good feelings released during a sexual assault? Again, it's about trying to block the pain, the physical pain, the psychological pain. So the body will release opiates, natural morphine, to try to tamp down the physical pain, and sometimes it will release oxytocin in conjunction with that to try to balance it out. Hormone that promotes good feelings, hormone that tries to blunt pain. Again, it's just trying to mitigate the pain of this assault. But if the oxytocin levels get a little high, sometimes survivors might laugh, giggle, smile, engage in socially appropriate behavior that's socially inappropriate given that situation. So those are the 4 hormones that can affect the behavior during the assault. And these hormones are really instrumental in blocking the physical pain, helping the body react to the trauma of the assault. Now here's the kicker. Those 4 hormones, very helpful in so many ways. When those 4 hormone levels are very high in the body, it interferes with other structures in your brain that are trying to lay down the neural mechanisms of the memory. So it's one of those times where our body's kind of working at cross purposes. Those hormones are really helpful for fight, for flight, for mitigating the pain, but they cause cellular damage in 2 key structures of our brain that work to lay down the memory. What we've learned from the neurobiology of trauma research is that the memories of traumatic events are stored in a very disorganized way. When the survivor sits down and tries to explain to either a responding officer or detective what happened in the assault, and it starts coming out in this bits and pieces, fragmented way, of they start one thing, but then they stop abruptly, and then they start talking about something else, or they start explaining it very generally, and then they start throwing in random details, it can be very confusing for law enforcement. And a lot of law enforcement, based on other training they've had, will look at that and say, this looks suspicious to me, because it seems like they're making it up as they're going along. They're not making it up as they're going along, they're having difficulty recalling the different pieces of the assault because of the way the trauma of the assault affected the way the memory is laid down. So for law enforcement, they see this completely disorganized, discombobulated presentation, and they say, I'm not believing this. This seems made up to me. What they're really seeing is evidence of trauma. What they're really seeing is how trauma impacts memory formation and then memory recall. So I think it's important for law enforcement to keep in mind that when they see that really confusing stop-start disorganized presentation, to think about that what they're seeing is trauma. What they're seeing is a survivor trying to reach into the different pieces and parts of their brain and all the different fragments of that memory, and they're doing their best to put it together and to give it back. Now the important thing to keep in mind is that the research is very clear that the accuracy of the memory is intact. So even though the storage is fragmented and can come out kind of sounding confusing and in bits and pieces, the actual recall, accurate. One way to explain how trauma affects memory is with a simple example of Post-it notes. Let's say that listening to this interview, you were trying to write down the information. And let's say rather than a nice tablet of paper, all I gave you was a Post-it note, a little tiny Post-it note. And that all you could do was write down the notes for this interview on Post-it notes. Well, depending upon the size of the Post-it note, you might be able to get a few words written down. You might, if you got a good sized Post-it note, you might be able to get several sentences down. Or if you got a good sized Post-it note, you'd be able to write many, many different things, okay? Now I want you to imagine trying to write down all the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. And I want you to gather them all up, and I want you to take them to a desk, the world's messiest desk. Because that's really what the human brain is. And I want you to take all these little precious Post-it notes that have your notes on them, and I want you to scatter them all over the desk. I want you to put some on top. I want you to stick some underneath in the pile. I want you to put some in the interview that's about sexual assault. I want you to put some that says policies and procedures manual. Obviously in this file. Scatter it everywhere. Now, imagine trying to come back to that world's messiest desk 24 hours, 36 hours, 3 weeks, 6 months later. Find all of the Post-it notes, get them, put them in the correct order, and tell it back. That's what we're asking survivors to do when we're asking them to recall a traumatic event, when we're asking them to tell their story.
Hopefully that will work. Now imagine that. Okay. Make sense? I mean, you can apply that to your personal life and traumas you've experienced for law enforcement. It's a little easier to understand why those interviews can be a little bit challenging. Anybody here traumatized right now? I mean, I'm not a big bad guy up here. I'm actually a big mush. Give me 2 things that were written down on the Post-it notes. 2 things. Any of all of them. I'm sorry? Don't judge. Don't be judgmental. One other thing.
Memory fragmented.
Memory is fragmented. Be surprised how many rooms I go in nobody remembers. And I say to them, well, if you can't remember something that simple in this environment, how do you expect people to remember during the middle of trauma? A very detailed, and you're all trained observers, right? Think about that. Think about what Dr. Campbell said. Okay, we're going to re-review the Gabby video clip, Gabby Petito video clip, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit when we're done. And I want you to think about this video clip in the context of what we heard from Dr. Campbell, what Courtney was talking about with the complexities of disclosure and all that stuff. Because now I'm hoping that you see and hear things a little bit differently.
I believe that I feel like it's I always like I really been fighting all morning and he would have me in the car or in the night. Told me to calm down. Yeah. I pretty calm all the time. And he really stresses me out and this is a rough morning.
Well, let me do this. Why don't I sit you down in the backseat of my car? You're not in any trouble. Okay, so I'm not going to be putting handcuffs on you. You obviously don't have any weapons. I'm going to get you into the air conditioning, let you take a breath, relax a little bit, and then I'll come back and talk to you in a few minutes, okay? All right. Like I said, you're not in any trouble. So just go ahead and take a seat. Please smile. So if you've been drinking, or look at this driving, like self-steady, did it hurt? While you're driving? While he's driving, your hand in? I was from East Coast. I don't know where. I have pictures where I don't know my phone. I don't have a phone. So she goes off now. Oh my God. So I was like, let's just go for a walk. But she was trying to use me for this going. Street past the company because I didn't get well. I didn't get more greatly through the block. Just trying to put her away and dump me. And then I got really That's fine. Okay, so obviously you push her to create some distance, obviously, right? What happened after that? Look up the scratches on your arm. The phone. So you push her and she hit you. I was going to push her. She was ready. I don't know. Very swinging there. And it was awful. Yeah, a lot of angles on nails on fingers. Scratching in there. Face here, we got the wall of the do you mind lifting up your right sleeve for me? I'm curious about something. Okay, I suppose fingernails, but I like them. Is it bruised or tender or anything like that? I'm fine. I hope that. I was going to say I feel bad that I have to get so tough. I was just trying to be loud. This is, I'm just trying to make it calm down. Like, look at the watch. Stop this. I don't know all this stuff. I saw years. Believe me, if I were to say that my wife had a kind of response, I'd be lying to you. She wasn't like, I live with her. I know. Her anxiety always anxiety. And sometimes
that's why I'm like, I gotta walk away, I gotta read this, and the back cars and go.
I'm not going to try to sit here and give you one. You've been on this whole almost as long as what I have. There's nothing I can tell you that's going to really make a difference. But at the end of the day, I'm sorry the loss is happening. I'm sorry that it goes to this. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not. Can I get my key and I go back? You can go. Oh, yeah, no problem. Can I read that? This is what I'm going to do. I've decided I'm not going to say for domestic violence. Okay. It was only going to be a class B misdemeanor. However, the domestic violence portion of it enhances it. And it's a major pain in the butt, especially in your 22, right? I'm choosing not to say it. So you are not going to be charged with it. Alright, but this is what I do have to do. I am separated tonight. Okay? I want you guys both to be tonight away from each other, relax, breathe, because there's no reason to be crying now, okay? This is, I understand that this can feel like it's a nightmare, but you're coming out as the golden flower on top of it, okay? So.
Okay. Does anybody not know the outcome of that case? She was murdered in a stream bed, strangled just about 30 miles from that scene. I just want to share with you something that maybe you do or don't know. You really can't see it in the body cam video. That was Gabby Petito's face that you can't see. That's what her face looked like in that police car when they were talking to her. I don't know if you've all seen it. Tough to see on the body cam video because it's just, cameras just are not that great. Certainly the ones that they were using. Did you all see it? That's her face. So let's talk about, because we're going to talk about interviewing now, we're going to talk about trauma. What did you hear from Gabrielle? Let's just talk about this. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's just to get your mind thinking as you talk about interviewing and think about the neurobiology of trauma. What dialogue did you hear from? What did you observe? What was trauma informed and what was not? Feedback to us. You all saw it. Be critical of law enforcement. If you think they did a good job, say so. I don't, but I know they did what they were trained to do. I know that because I've spoken to the trainers out there. But go ahead, share.
This is West Iowa, working here.
Sure.
Department was much more calm, trying to kind of get the police on the side.
Mm-hmm. Ask the manipulator, right? What else?
to a fight or more stress
Okay?
Hey, Dave, can you repeat what some of the people were saying? It's just a little.
So they're talking about trauma. It was a morning of trauma
Yeah,
that
no, I
obviously
just-
they were engaging. I know, does this microphone work?
It's not you, it's people in the
Test,
audience. Can you repeat what the audience people are saying?
Test. Oh. Here we go. There you go, Ben. Thank you. You're gonna get your running shoes on now, buddy. Okay, who else?
She was having trouble catching her breath. She
Betcha.
was very out of breath for
Very out
sitting
of
still
breath.
in the back of the car.
Yes, she was very, so just the behavior alone, what you said, right? Which person was behaving, right? Breathing hard, bending over, having a hard time catching her breath? Who seemed distressed? A lot of times I feel like that's misinterpreted, right? She was the one in more distress than he was, given the behaviors. And she said something that I don't know, it was hard to hear, but she actually had said, he was telling me to calm down, but I'm actually a really calm person. Did anyone else catch that? Right? So she's kind of saying, but I am a calm person. So just listening to some of her words.
I think one of the things she said right before you put her in the car was, I'm just having a really bad day, and I feel it's like a missed opportunity to ask more questions.
What was so bad about the day? What was going on? Yeah, and what else?
So we're going to kind of take a deeper dive into interviewing techniques as we kind of navigate through the rest of this. And rather than spend too much time on this, if you get a chance and you really want to learn how not to do things, watch that video from start to finish. They actually identified Gabby as the primary aggressor, what you don't see on that video. And I know there was one individual here that said they watched the whole video. But for the actions of one police officer who said, there is no way we are arresting her because he was not the agency in charge. He said, she is the victim. We are not arresting her. And that changed the mind of the officer that said, I'm not going to arrest you, I'm not going to charge you with domestic violence. Very astute, trauma-informed officer that intervened. Now, if they arrested her, would it have saved her life? I mean, we could argue that forever. But the reality is, we're now going to talk about how to look at things and be trauma-informed, how to conduct those interviews, what they look like, where they should occur, what language you use, what language you never use.
And one more thing, just jumping back, we're showing this slide twice because it's so important, right? We want to look at red flags, helping us to understand, but also the context of the scene. One of those things being, is the story lining up? Is the story making sense? So I just want to highlight one other thing in that video. Did anyone catch why he was saying that he didn't want her to just go? At the very beginning, he said, well, I don't have a phone. If she just took off, then I'd be stranded without a phone. He told them that he didn't have a phone, but he had a phone, right? So he pulls the phone right out. So again, just he was lying in those moments. So just being aware, is the story making sense? You said you didn't have a phone, but here's your phone.
Courtney and I did a national webinar about a year ago and showed that video. There were 450 people on it. One person picked up on the phone. And it was predominantly law enforcement. And again, I don't fault them. But you have to catch that, okay, this is what he said. And then he asks for a phone number, he pulls out a cell phone. So the very first thing out of his mouth, the reason for his behavior was a lie. The very first words out of his mouth to that law enforcement, other than his name, was a lie. An absolute premeditated lie.
And he touched his pocket that the phone was in too when he lied.
I didn't notice that. That's good.
He does. He
Good
looks, I
catch.
don't have a phone, and he taps it.
Yep. Okay. So interviewing. Boy, again, there are a lot of great courses on interviewing out there. People ask me, are you an expert interviewer? No, I'm not. I'm just an interviewer. And I use the term loosely because I like to consider it, especially when we're talking about trafficking. Interviews happen, but I call it a conversation. My first engagement with a trafficking victim is I introduce myself, and I'm dressed like this, I wear jeans and a golf shirt, because I've done too many where they just are afraid to talk to me because I'm that authority figure, I'm the cop, I'm the guy with the badge, you have to never wear your badge, never wear your gun, none of that. You have to in the moment, maybe when you're doing a sting or something, and we can talk about that a lot, but be trauma informed. Know what you're walking into. Try to do it in a comfortable environment where a victim feels safe. The police department interview room is not that place. Speak to an advocate. We talk about multidisciplinary. Speak to an advocacy agency. They all have locations where there's couches, recliners, and just very comfortable rooms to engage victims. Step out of our cultural way of doing things in that glass mirrored, two-chaired, single-table room that we're conducting interviews, and do it in a more comfortable place where they don't feel that this authority is now interrogating them. We'll talk a little bit about interpreters, but only utilize vetted interpreters. Never utilize interpreters at the scene. The reason for that, you may not understand the dynamics of the situation. If you don't speak the language, you have no clue what they're saying. And so you got to really be careful. The only time I say you can do that and it's okay is if there's an immediate life threat, a question like, is there anybody in this house that we need to know about or get out quickly? That kind of question you can ask. But as far as what occurred and kind of the whole situation, don't use somebody in the same household. Avoid trying to control a victim from start to finish. Hey, Courtney, I got to come up and interview Kelly on Friday. The sergeant's giving me a hard time. I'm working at 4 to 12. Can you have her available at 4:30? You know what, Dave? She's got a dentist appointment. Oh, Courtney, my sergeant's breaking my stones. I really got to get in there and get this deposition. You can't see her today, Dave. You can't be Courtney. You can't do this to me. I need this to be done. Okay. Figure out another time. That's exercise of control. That's that cultural shift. We have to, especially with trafficking victims, stepping aside from the DV piece, it's going to take 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 interviews to glean good information over time anyway. That's just the nature of this business because it's trust over time. And plus, factoring in trauma, detail will come with that. Avoid aggressive interviewing techniques. Never hover. I mean, again, I don't think I have to really go into deep detail here, but it's pretty much common sense, right? We don't do that to victims. We don't hover. Look for their body behavior. Look for the shrug. If they maintain eye contact and all of a sudden you lose it and they shrug their shoulders, you've hit a nerve. You've triggered something. Stop. Back off. You okay? Right? Whatever. You may have to end the interview, but you have to recognize that in the moment because that victim just shut down on you. It should evolve from an empathetic conversation. Listen, I have to get some basic information from you for this DIR. Now, can you tell me? Speak to them like a human being from step one. My name is Dave Ryan. This is what I'm here for. You go into your detail, you call 911. Are you comfortable talking here? Is there someplace else you'd rather talk? Is there something you need right now before we start this interview? First 3 trafficking interviews I ever did when we did the search warrant in Pound Ridge, one wanted to brush their teeth. She was not permitted to brush her teeth for a year. The other wanted something to eat. The other wanted a can of Coke. There was no Coke in the house. We sent a cop down to the market, got her a can of Coke, and did not start that interview until she had that Coca-Cola in hand. Conversation. Don't hover, right? We don't hover. We see somebody, bad guys, hover. You see them get out of their zone of tolerance, you go in for the kill. Victims, you completely back off because you're now exercising the same power and threatening control that the abusers do, the traffickers do.
Just to highlight on the controlling of the victim piece, a lot of times unintentionally, we end up behaving in ways similar to a perpetrator if we try to control the victim in any particular way. When you think about a trafficking situation, 2 things are at play all the time. Someone can't predict or control their own health and safety every day. They have no ability to predict or control those things. That's why it's so important that as we work with them, we let them have choice and control in what's happening, and we have predictability in what is going to happen next, that they have an understanding of what is happening next. So predictability and control for the victim are so important in those moments.
Last one about letting them know you care about their well-being. That kind of comes at the start of the interview. When I open any interview with a trafficking victim, I talk about me, not police. Father of 2 girls, here's a picture of my daughters. I want them to get to know me in a different light, not look at me as the police, because that's what they're thinking, that it's an interrogation, an interview. No, I want it to be a conversation, back and forth on their terms. Some other tips, again, being trauma-informed, thinking about disclosure, we don't ask specific questions. Remember what color shirt he had? Do you remember if it was a semi-automatic pistol or was it a revolver? Or what finger was the ring on? That's detail that you're just not going to get. And we've been trained forever to get that who, what, when, where, why, how. A nice, neat chronological order with the deposition, because that's what the prosecutors wanted way back when, to get a nice, neat package to prosecute. That's different now. Prosecutors will bring experts to testify about trauma. They did it in the case that we just got the conviction on. They bring in an expert and say, they didn't lie on these 3 depositions. This is trauma, and this is what trauma is and what it looks like. And the jury clearly understood that, right? So that's important to know. Ask them open-ended questions. You know, when they travel, where they live. Again, we could get into a lot of detail, and I don't want to fall behind here on the presentation because I want to get through it. But if you ask open-ended questions, you're not asking a victim to go into a specific area of the brain where that bit of detail is. So one of the examples I give is if you have a strangulation or criminal obstruction of breathing, and they say, well, you said he put his hand over your mouth. Tell me more about that. And let him just tell you. Let him just talk. Sit back, don't interrupt, and hear what they have to say. All of a sudden you'll get those, because you're not asking to find that little tidbit of information, that one post-it note. You're asking to say, okay, go into that file and tell me anything you can remember that's in that file in your brain. This is a resource that is available on a website. If you Google Blue Campaign, people ask me all the time, well, when we have this, when we think we have it, what do we ask? They will give you these cards for free. They're plastic, they're very laminated, and they last a long time. I give them out at every single training. Every law enforcement, not today, but any law enforcement training, but you can go on and order these for your department. We actually recreated them on the back of a resource card so that once you have the indicators, people say, okay, now I got the information, what do I do? Flip the card over, call any one of those numbers. They're going to help you. This is specific to Westchester.
And what's important about this is these are questions you can ask yourself. So starting really broadly with the victim and talking from a kind of broader level, open-ended questions, and as you hear their answers, even having that card for yourself, ticking those boxes off, okay, they're saying this, they're saying that, they're saying this, and then you can say to yourself, wow, I really do think this is a trafficking case. So just something accessible that you can have and look at as you're, hearing these different buzzwords or things that they're saying while you're interviewing them. Another tool that is really useful, this is from the medical field, it's called the PEER tool. And it's basically best practices in being trauma-informed. And it was created for medical providers, but again, as we talk about reaching across different silos, looking at different areas for tools that are really effective. This is the same exact thing Dave was just speaking to. You're starting out with really kind of broad, more general questions. You're trying to build trust. You're creating privacy, right? Separating, very important to separate anyone, right, a potential trafficker from the victim, making sure that they're not in the same room when you're doing the interviews. If there's more than one victim, separate the victims from one another because you do not know if there's not a hierarchy within the victims. You don't know that one of the victims may then report back to the trafficker. So making sure that there is privacy and an ability to talk. So it talks about these things, so providing that privacy, educating about intimate partner violence, about human trafficking in a broad way. I often give this card out, or I give this information out to everyone that I meet with because this is such a common issue. Or, I hear some red flags, and I'm wondering if this isn't happening to you. And chances are, a lot of times people will say, oh, no, that's not me. They might not be ready to disclose in that moment, but that doesn't mean that you can't provide them with an information or number that they could then come back to if and when they choose to. And I like to tell people this because sometimes they think, oh, that person didn't want my help or they didn't take it. That doesn't mean that 6 months later, that person didn't, you didn't plant a seed and they go back to it. I worked with one survivor who was given a card 6 months before she used it. She had gotten to a point in her situation where she realized she really needed to get out, And she went back and found the card in the back pocket of a pair of jeans that had gone through the washer a few times, and she called the number 6 months later. So even in that moment, if you don't get them to say something right away, doesn't mean you didn't plant a seed. So educating, asking them if they want any further assistance, and then respecting their answer. Yes or no, if you are going to respond, having an idea of who you're going to link them up with. And this can be different with youth, right? If it's a mandated reporter call, then it's a mandated reporter call. But especially with adults, if they're saying no, not right now, or they're not willing to take something, then listening to them and doing as they're asking.
This is my everyday job, this tool. I see them every day when I run the domestic violence high-risk team. Every lap screen from Westchester comes into me for me to look at. Here's what I tell officers when they ask this. This is just the starting point. This is not a checklist. But it does 3 things. It assesses a level of danger that we were not able to assess from a law enforcement perspective prior to this. And that's danger to the victim, the household they live in, and responding police officers. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it is, in our experiences with the 4,000 plus victims that we've identified, is it is, as Courtney mentioned earlier, it is very eye-opening for a victim who's experiencing these things every day, but compensating so much that to them it's just normal. But it's not, it's danger. And it really tells them you are at risk of death, period. That's the truth, death. Now, Jackie Campbell uses the terms homicide or serious physical harm. Well, they're this far apart, right? That's the reality of what we're dealing with. So this is an incredibly valuable tool, and without getting into detail, I applaud DCJS and OPDV last year with their new policy that came out in September of 23, that the questions that are on the DIR, the 6 of these questions of the 12, you are mandated to make a phone call from this. It doesn't say may, it says shall. So you have to connect that victim to advocacy. That's a game changer in this business.
And as Dave said, this danger assessment, have you guys heard of it before, Jackie Campbell's danger assessment? Do many of you already use it?
How many law enforcement agencies use this at every intimate partner violence call in your respective jurisdiction? Where are you? Oh, I know you because you're from Batesville. How are you, Sarge? Every responding police officer, almost 4,000 of them in Westchester, use this at every intimate partner call. It's a game changer. If you don't believe me, speak to Sergeant Carter in the back. She has instituted her department, St. Petersville, and it really has changed the way officers view domestic violence.
And this tool is really important because if you don't know much about it, Jackie Campbell researched, amongst all of the different things that happen in intimate partner violence, what are those things that indicate the highest probability of death, right, of lethality? And things like firearms in the home, strangulation, are questions on there. So if you're taking off those boxes, and in particular if firearms are in the home and there's been strangulation, those are very high risk factors for death, for homicide, for that victim. And so utilizing a tool like this can be life-saving for people. I use it in my practice with any survivor that I have coming in an intimate partner situation to assess their level of danger within the relationship. Dave uses it throughout all of Westchester County. I highly encourage you to, if you're not using it in your departments, to use it. These are just a few other tools, things that you can look up. Again, this is from the medical field, but it's a rapid appraisal for trafficking, which is 4 questions. So if you have started out and you've asked some broad questions and you have your Homeland Security card and you've ticked off these boxes in your head and said, wow, I really do think I have trafficking. If I wanted to ask another question, what could I ask? Here are 4 questions that can help you delve a little deeper.
Before we go on, how many people in advocacy in here? Advocacy or non-law enforcement? Every client should be screened with those 4 questions. You should be asking these questions when you screen in every client. Again, it's part of digging deeper. We talk about law enforcement, everybody needs to dig deeper.
And as you're asking the questions, always keeping in mind, right, that you have to maintain or try to build some level of trust with the victim survivor. The relationship has to be collaborative, giving them choice, giving them predictability. Please, 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 if you say you're going to do something for a survivor, do it. I'm going to meet you on this day at this time. Unless something really horrific happens and there's a real reason you can't be there, please be there. Because if you break trust with that person and they know that they can't count on you, you've lost that opportunity. Survivors really do need predictability and control in their situations, giving them a heads up about what to expect. Those kinds of things can be really useful. They really need to be able to trust you, or they're just not going to open up. And as Dave said, it can take 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 interviews and meetings to really get the full picture of what has happened to somebody. And then respecting and informing and connecting them to different services, listening to what it is that they need. Dave talked about, with those 3 different survivors, they each wanted something different. Listening to what they're asking for can make a real difference. This is just another tool. This is my organization. It's a concealable leaflet you can hand out if you're an advocate. So if someone says, oh, no, that's not me, you can say, oh, here, take this leaflet, read through it later. If you change your mind or if you want information, there's some contact information.
This is the other side of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember the triangle? Remember how we showed you how they break down victims? Physiological needs, the support, all that stuff all the way up to the top. This is how we rebuild victims, right? The immediate, the physiological needs, the food, the sleep, the safety, the medical needs. Just, again, a comfortable place to go to sleep after taking a warm shower. We take advantage of that every day. Victims don't get that, especially trafficking victims. But again, this is how our collaborative partners rebuild those victims and survivors that we send to them. And we need to understand this because we need to start rebuilding. That's the only way this works. We need to rebuild that foundation to gain their trust, to just kind of get them on the pathway to healing. And that really creates, especially working with advocates, just a much greater level of cooperation. And then collaboration. If you're not working in multidisciplinary teams today, you're failing yourself, you're failing victims, period, end of story. I know OPDB and DCGS are really, this is kind of the next generation of training that's going to come in the very near future, these coordinated community responses. They're not easy. When we started our domestic violence high-risk team, we had run a pilot after a homicide in the town where I lived, where I worked. It was 2 years of tense dialogue because one, law enforcement doesn't understand confidentiality and survivor advocacy doesn't understand law enforcement. And to kind of bridge that, we had to have a lot of tense dialogue. But it works. And if you do it right, you'll get through the tense moments, and the benefit on the back end is for you, for the clients you serve, for the community, for your own safety. It really on the back end has tremendous reward, but it takes a cultural shift. We're there because the agencies that need to implement this are doing it. Work with them and do it. It's challenging even, there are some counties that we've gone and trained where we can't get 2 advocacy agencies to sit at the table, or we can't get 2 law enforcement agencies that still have these freaking turf wars. Those days are behind us. Get past them.
And just again, as you're collaborating, working with victims, trying to work across these different multidisciplinary teams, it's really important for everyone to understand, so if you're an advocate or law enforcement, that we all have different end goals, right? The prosecutor wants to prosecute the case. Law enforcement wants to build the evidence. The victim advocate is helping to protect the victim and a variety of things. So keeping in mind that even if our end goals are different, the survivor needs to be at the center of it. And modeling healthy communication and relationships across those disciplines is huge. If you have bad relationships between, say, law enforcement and an advocacy agency, the survivor is going to pick up on that, and they are not going to then trust law enforcement. So it's really important to build those relationships in advance, because I know when I tell my clients, I know you can trust Dave. I know if you talk with him, he's going to do everything he can, right? I also try to manage their expectations depending on what's going on. But if I can say to someone who trusts me, I trust Dave, I know that he will have your best interests, then they're more likely to trust Dave. So building those relationships in advance, knowing what you can and can't do, do not overpromise to a victim. Don't tell them you can do something that you can't do. That's really important. Making sure that you don't try to rescue somebody. Yes, I know there are operations that go in and that's like pulling people out, but what I mean by that is survivors do not like the idea of people telling them, oh yeah, we're going to rescue you. It takes away, it's less empowering for them. So don't try to take on this rescuer role, because a lot of us survivors are pretty offended by that. Maintaining your own safety also. So just keeping in mind different boundaries, professional boundaries as you're doing your work.
Just on that last bullet there, you know, one of the things I teach, I work with an organization called the Leadership Institute to Combat Human Trafficking, and they're actually teaching next week down in New Orleans, and unfortunately I can't attend, but one of my segments, and it's leadership from law enforcement throughout the country, police chiefs and commissioners, there's no rank lower than that permitted, unless if it's a captain, their chief or commissioner has to be there. One of the things I teach is wellness. Wellness for the individuals doing this work, law enforcement, advocacy, everybody. You need to be cognizant of that. You really do. You know, there is burnout, there is our own accumulated trauma, there's so many things that impact us, and if you say it doesn't, you're just lying to yourself. It's going to change your behavior. You're going to see police officers start drinking. You're going to see a lot of different things and behavioral changes that come with that kind of fatigue and burnout. If you're a boss in this room, you have a responsibility to recognize that. Recognize that burnout and intervene. And I say that because if you don't, it will be demonstrated in the interviews that are forthcoming down the road. So just something to think about, but it's a very, very real thing. These are just some resources that Courtney and I list. Obviously, there's, depending on where you are from in the state, we have 1 minute left. It's a sub sign. Depending on where you are from in the state, here's what my best answer to you is. There's resources everywhere. I collaborate with human trafficking task forces all over the world, not just all over the country, because we've had victims in Westchester from Hungary, Norway, Brazil, Guatemala. I mean, just, you have to have all these connections. These are just some resources. Know what your resources are in the communities you serve. Anybody up here from Erie County? Erie County has one of the best human trafficking task forces in this country. They really do. Matter of fact, I used to train very, very often with Indian Fly Shower from the International Institute of Buffalo, one of the best in the business. You see, we'll be in New Orleans without me. But these are resources that are available to you, so if you don't know what to do, pick up the phone and call them. And if you're not sure who to call, I tell this to everybody, call me. I have resource lists from everywhere, and I can connect you with somebody somewhere. It might not be the person you need to speak to, but they know the person you need to speak to. So just use the resources that are out there. Don't just walk away. That's just the part. I don't know anybody in Norway, so why should I bother? Make that connection. Okay. So again, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. I have an acronym that I use. It's from the Poundridge Elementary School. It's one of my favorite acronyms, TEAM. Together everyone achieves more. That's the way this business works for me. So one, Courtney and I both thank you for being here today. I know it's a little bit warm. I know we went through a lot of stuff quickly. Every segment of this can be broken into a day, 2-day, 3-day training. Thank you, Ben and DCJS, for the opportunity to speak today. We'll be here for a few minutes to answer any questions. I want to be respectful of your time and your day. I don't know who's driving, who's staying, but we have now completed our presentation. Thank you.
One housekeeping item, both these presentations are uploaded to the Symposium mobile app as PDFs now. So if you go and refresh that app, you'll have the whole slideshow.